More war films tomorrow with Ill Met by Moonlight at 9 o'clock. Now, though, uncovering forgotten gems and revisiting classics in a documentary look at how accurately war is presented in the local cinema.
It's the war. The whole bloody war.
There were some chaps in the water just there.
The memory of the Second World War is today at the very heart of British national identity.
Well, the training's over.
But for most of us, much of what we know about the war has come not through museums or history books, but through war films.
You're going to attack the Great Dam.
There are hundreds of British war films made since the start of the fighting in 1939. Through these films, we've learnt about every aspect of the war. The battles at sea.
Well done. We've got him, but I'm afraid he's got us too.
The struggles in the deserts of Africa.
There's the compass. Take all the food and water you want, keep on 30 degrees for 2 days, and I'll help it keep fine for you.
Life on the home front.
If you're going on like this, I wish I'd never met you.
Some were adventure stories, others brutal in their realism. Many war films have been forgotten, but others have endured to become some of the nation's favourite movies.
If I'd known it was going to be like this, I never have started.
But taken as a whole, what have they taught us about the war? Have they told us what it was really like? How did the war seen on the screen differ from that fought on the beaches and landing grounds? Over the next 2 hours, we're going to find out.
Hi, they're getting all sorts now.
We'll also discover how these films achieved the seemingly impossible.
How do you mean?
They helped wartime audiences to make light of the conflict and laugh at their predicament.
Not if I let you block up first.
They also taught the British how to lampoon their enemies.
There's too much noise.
We were laughing.
Ah, laughing.
They helped make the war endurable for millions.
Less said, the better.
Above all, we'll discover why these films still matter and how they have helped shape our memory of one of the greatest events in our history.
Don't tune me out. Hang on a while. This is a big story, and you're part of it.
The first British war film in our story comes from the pen of H.G. Wells, Things to Come. It showed how the coming of war destroyed the lives of the people of one city.
Orders for a general mobilization have been issued, and the precautionary civilian organization against gas will at once be put into operation. Our instructions have just come to hand. We shall cut off for 5 minutes, and then read you the general instructions. Please call in all your friends. Call in everyone you can.
But what really shocked audiences was how Things to Come portrayed the terrible power of the most feared weapon of the time, the bomber.
So you get this sequence of the massed planes coming over the White Cliffs of Dover, unloading on the city centre.
Things to Come was regarded as a horrifyingly realistic war film. But what's really shocking about it was that it was made 3 years before World War II began.
Before the Second World War, there was this absolutely widespread theory that air power would be this devastating weapon of the next war. In fact, they overestimated the effect of air power in the Second World War, but they assumed that the first raid by an enemy power would flatten a city and civil society would break down. And you can see that fear that runs through the film.
And very cleverly, the first bomb lands on the cinema. So audiences going to the pictures in 1936 would suddenly realise what it's like to be trapped in a cinema in 1940 with the bombardment of cities.
The cinema audiences of 1936 would not have long to wait until much of the nightmare vision seen in Things to Come would start to come true.
His name upon it as well as mine.
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty.
This morning, German troops made a formal entry into the demilitarized
A state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
The day after Prime Minister Chamberlain's declaration of war, his government did something that is today forgotten, but which at the time infuriated many people. It closed down all of Britain's 4,500 cinemas. For a moment, there was a risk of there being no British wartime cinema and no British war films. But instead, the war was to be the making of the British cinema industry. It was Alexander Korda, the producer behind Things to Come, who persuaded the government that rather than being a threat to national security, cinema was an essential weapon of war. Korda suspended production of his latest epic, The Thief of Baghdad. He diverted his efforts to unleashing the power of cinema as a propaganda weapon.
The day war broke out, Korda contacted the government and placed the whole of his production organisation at their disposal and offered to make the first propaganda film of the war.
Just 8 weeks after the start of the war, Korda's film was finished, and the first prints of The Lion Has Wings arrived in cinemas. The whole nation, still shocked by the outbreak of hostilities, was desperate to see the war portrayed on screen. The Lion Has Wings did not disappoint. What it offered was reassurance. Reassurance that although Britain had been pushed into a war she never wanted, now in it, she was going to win.
The best bit of the film is the 3 Spitfires going up. The droning sound of the planes. You have a sort of First World War style dogfight with the Nazis where the Spitfires win, which is a kind of prophecy of the Battle of Britain.
Very little actual fighting took place in 1939, so the images of battle in The Lion Has Wings were based on incredibly accurate guesswork. But at times, this guesswork gave way to wishful thinking.
It's quite laughable in some respects, because there's a scene where a German bombing raid turns back because they're frightened of barrage balloons.
They climb and climb. They dare not face the entanglement of those awful strands of steel. The balloons have forced them up too high for accurate bombing. They turn and make for home.
It does have an incredibly optimistic view. British technology is ready. We're ready with our barrage balloons. England expects. We know the Navy is wonderful ever since Trafalgar. We know the Army always gets there for the last battle. What we don't know about is the RAF. We're here to tell you we're ready as well.
We can learn from the motto of the Royal Air Force, per ardua ad astra. Through ordeal to the stars, through endeavour to triumph, through trial to victory.
Although The Lion Has Wings presented a hugely over-optimistic view of Britain's military readiness, there's no doubt that it chimed with beliefs most of the British public held in those early months of the war.
It very much reinforces what they've been taught at school. And one of the few things that they can remember is this big map on the classroom wall, where 3/4 of the globe is painted pink. Britain is the greatest power in the world. So when your government starts telling you, and showing you films to reinforce the message that we are really well prepared, that we are going to win this war. You may be sceptical about how well prepared you are, but there's really nothing in your life experience to make you doubt any of this stuff. We are British, we are superior, we are going to win.
The Lion Has Wings was a product of that strange period of inactivity known as the Phony War, in which Britain and her allies prepared for a great showdown with Germany.
Number 12 platform at Waterloo Station engaged today on the evacuation of London's school children.
Britain amply demonstrates her willingness to share the burden of the war on the Western Front.
Dad, don't get worried about us. We're all very happy here.
On this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization.
But the battle Britain was preparing for in early 1940 never materialized. Instead, the phony war came crashing to an end in a way that no one had foreseen.
The problem with what happens is it happens very quickly. Suddenly, with the sort of coincidence that if you put it in a film no one would believe, Churchill becomes Prime Minister just as the Germans launch their major assault in the West. And within 6 weeks, the world has been turned upside down. By this time, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium and France are all under German control. The British have been thrown out of Europe, scuttling away from Dunkirk as fast as they could go.
At Dunkirk, the British abandoned not only their military equipment, but also much of the over-optimism that had characterized the war films of 1939. The nation was in shock, and with no victories to glamorize, producers rushed to make films designed to shore up crumbling national morale.
Like a soldier.
In the months after Dunkirk, these were mainly comedies. But the film that did the most for national morale was Let George Do It, starring the country's most popular entertainer.
He shouted, "What a hope," as he chewed a bar of soap.
George Formby was a huge star, not just in his native Lancashire, but across the nation, and he took his audience with him from the musical into films.
And there was one scene in Let George Do It that helped British audiences recover from the trauma of Dunkirk.
One of the biggest morale boosters in the early years of the war was the fantasy sequence in Let George Do It, where George flies to Nuremberg.
I wipe the British Empire from the face of the earth. I want you. Why? You're my last territorial demand in Europe. British Schweinehund, for that I knock your head off on the block. Not if I knock you a block off first.
You couldn't get a more propagandistic scene than that. And yet, when they questioned the audience, 80% of the audience said this film was not propaganda. Now, this is very interesting because it means that they don't associate comedy with propaganda, and yet it is propagandistic a film, as you could see.
If Let George Do It was propaganda to lift spirits at home, many filmmakers began to realize that it was just as important to appeal to Americans, who in 1940 had no interest in getting involved in a European war. There were several British directors then working in Hollywood who began to use their position to make films that suggested America should support Britain's struggle against fascism. And amongst them was Alfred Hitchcock.
There he was in the United States, unable to get back to England. He ought to be doing something. A lot of his colleagues, Alexander Korda was simultaneously making British propaganda films in Hollywood and getting into trouble for it. And I think Hitchcock must have felt he ought to contribute as well.
The result was Foreign Correspondent, the story of a New York reporter who slowly becomes entangled in Britain's struggle against the Nazis.
Are you Mr. Jones? Yes. Sit down, please. Oh. You mind a personal question? No.
Are you married?
No luck.
Single, eh? Ever been in Europe?
No.
What's your opinion of the present European crisis, Mr. Jones?
What crisis?
I'm referring to the impending war, Mr. Jones.
Oh, that?
Yeah.
Well, to tell you the truth, Mr. Powers, I haven't given it much thought.
You don't keep up with our foreign news, do you, Mr.
Very important in this opening scene that he knows nothing about European politics. So this puts him in such a strange position. It shows him as a noble person, as someone who is suddenly confronted by aggression, and he then reports it.
Foreign Correspondent was a thriller
Follow that car, quick!
full of car chases and intrigue, with Nazis and spies behind a plot to kidnap a European statesman. But the subtext was to put Britain's case to the American people, not all of whom were convinced.
All the opinion polls that were taken up until Pearl Harbor showed a vast majority of the population against being involved in a European war. There was a long tradition of Anglophobia, particularly amongst the Irish Americans. There was a strong German and Italian American population, some of whom sympathised with fascism. And there were fascists.
And this is Fritz Kuhn, leader of a German-American Bund, hiding behind the American flag, but taking his orders from Berlin and copying the methods of Berlin.
So there was a sizable chunk of American opinion that wanted no involvement at all in Europe and no promotion of pro-British feeling.
During the making of Foreign Correspondent, the tide of war turned against Britain, and Hitchcock decided to make changes that revealed his true patriotic colours.
Alfred Hitchcock had shot an ending of the film where George Sanders and Joel McCrea have a chat about what the story was about. But he reckoned it was too weak, given what was happening in Europe. So he brought in Ben Hecht, a real expose kind of writer, to write a different ending, which was Joel McCrea standing in London during a bombing raid, this was before the Blitz, trying to do a broadcast to the Americans.
They're listening in America, Johnny.
Okay, we'll tell them. I can't read the rest of the speech I had because the lights have gone out, so I'll just have to talk off the cuff. All that noise you hear isn't static. It's death coming to London. Yes, they're coming here now. You can hear the bombs falling on the streets and the homes. Don't tune me out. Hang on a while. This is a big story, and you're part of it. It's too late to do anything here now except stand in the dark and let them come. It's as if the lights were all out everywhere, except in America. Keep those lights burning there. Cover them with steel. Bring them with guns. Build a canopy of battleships.
It's a very, very powerful ending. Unfortunately, it has nothing whatsoever to do with the preceding film. But the last 5 minutes is the bit that everyone remembers because it was the most topical and the most urgent.
This famous scene proved to be even more topical than Hitchcock had imagined.
The irony is that within a few weeks, the real Blitz started and bombs really did fall on London and buildings were burnt and lives were lost.
On the night of the 7th of September 1940, the Luftwaffe first attacked London. From then on, they came every night, killing thousands. Each morning, Londoners awoke to a city they hardly recognized. The eyes of the world turned to Britain, most presuming that under the bombing, she would collapse, just as France had done 3 months earlier.
Roosevelt had been told by his ambassador, Joe Kennedy, the father of the later president, J.F. Kennedy, that the British would be bound to surrender when the bombing started.
To show the world that Britain was surviving the Blitz, a film was rushed into production. It became a global sensation and is still regarded as one of the greatest war films of all time. But London Can Take It was not an action film or a thriller, but a documentary. It told the story of one day in the life of London during the Blitz.
The dusk is deepening. Listening crews are posted all the way from the coast to London to pick up the drone of the German planes. Soon the nightly battle of London will be on. This has been a quiet day for us, but it won't be a quiet night. We haven't had a quiet night now for more than 5 weeks. They'll be over tonight, and they'll destroy a few buildings and kill a few people. Probably some of the people you are watching now.
The film was about the people of London, but it was made for American audiences.
It was designed to be shown in 15,000 cinemas in North America and Latin America, and the Ministry of Information, which commissioned the film from the GPO film unit, had done a deal with the Warner Brothers to use their distribution network. So it got seen by a lot of Americans at exactly the right time.
This is the music they play every night in London, the Symphony of War.
What it tried to show Americans was that Britain was a country worth fighting for. It wasn't just an old imperial, class-ridden, stuffy, fuddy-duddy country. And also, of course, it was a country that was taking it. It wasn't just sitting there waiting for American aid. It was fighting back.
Yet the People's Army ignores the bombs and the spent shrapnel which rains down constantly.
London Can Take It was much more than propaganda. It perfectly captured the mood of most Londoners in the face of the bombing.
I worked in London on a newspaper during the Blitz, and we used to go out and watch the searchlights and, you know, hear the shrapnel coming down and the anti-aircraft fire. Okay, so I was 17, and it's maybe different, but people didn't, on the whole, panic under the bombing.
The German bombers are creatures of the night. They melt away before the dawn and scurry back to the safety of their own airdromes.
Nobody ever showed films in America of the Cockneys, of the East End. Now, all of a sudden, what you're showing the Americans is that this isn't imperialist, aristocratic Britain. These are ordinary Joes, if you like, just like, you know, the inhabitants of Midwestern towns, showing a tremendous heroism in the face of really pretty ghastly circumstances.
The shops are open as usual. In fact, many of them are more open than usual.
The impact that it has in a country that, America, that, you know, isn't famous for its understanding of international events, must have been huge. I really do think it was like that video footage of the planes going into the side of the World Trade Center. It was that immediate, you know, the buses being overturned, the buildings being blown up.
I can see practically the whole of London spread round me.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war.
And British women worked alongside men.
Bereits 2233 sowjetische Panzerkampfwagen vernichtet oder erbeutet.
In December 1941, the direction of World War II suddenly changed when the Japanese attacked America's Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor.
7:55 a.m., hell broke loose. Man-made hell, made in Japan. By 9:45, the attack was over.
America's entry into the war was also Hollywood's. The studios rushed to make war films. Eventually, Hollywood's view of the war would come to define international memory of the conflict. But for Britain, what mattered was the arrival of a powerful new ally, one that seemed at first to offer salvation.
There's an initial marvellous enthusiasm when the American enters. It's almost like, gosh, what a relief. Churchill expresses this in his memoirs when, in a passage that didn't go down terribly well in America, he wrote that when he heard of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, a great wave of relief spread over him. Most Americans thought he should have been rather upset because so many American lives had been lost. But instead of the war suddenly starting to improve, it suddenly goes very badly wrong.
What threatened Britain's very survival in 1942 was no longer the bombers over London, but the desperate struggle taking place in the Atlantic.
We were losing merchant ships and their escorts, and even battleships and aircraft carriers. Massive loss of life in the Navy. We never saw it, you know. It wasn't like a defeat of an army that you could see retreating or you can mark it on a map. The Battle of the Atlantic was very, very, very bloody indeed.
Britain, after all, is still having to import a lot of its food, and once America's in the war, a lot of its armaments. And all of these things have to be brought by ship, and certainly during 1942, the British come perilously close to losing the Battle of the Atlantic.
With Britain's lifelines close to being severed by the U-boats, cinema audiences flock to see a new film about the Navy.
There goes another. Big stuff. The rest of the division are doing well. Must be an enemy destroyer, sir. Right. Engage her. Aye, aye, sir. Check. Ship target left. Follow.
In Which We Serve was probably the most popular film of the Second World War, made during the Second World War.
The writer, star and co-director of In Which We Serve was Noel Coward, and it was on the deck of the HMS Torrin as Captain D that Coward found his true wartime role.
Well done. We've got him, but I'm afraid he's got us too.
It was a film that I think everyone wanted to see made, everyone wanted to engage and involve Noel Coward in the war effort, and it represented Noel's very specific view of men, heroism, again, sacrifice.
The film starts after the HMS Torrin has been sunk off Greece, and you see a number of guys clinging to this life raft.
Miss Butterfingers!
And they're all small cogs in a giant mechanism, and as long as they subordinate their own pursuit of happiness, their own passions to the general well-being, the general good, we're going to pull through this in the end.
Oh, look, boys. Shot through the heart. I always did hate the sight of blood.
The film was good. It even had the courage to show cowardice. Dickie Attenborough, Richard Attenborough's part, you know, the boy who got bomb happy.
Trying to imagine looking at that film at the time, many, many young people would identify very keenly with Dickie and the character he plays. Of course they were terrified. Of course they didn't necessarily behave in the way that they would like to behave.
One of the really interesting things about In Which We Serve was the bringing together for the first time really of the military and the battlefield, as it were, which in this case was the sea, and the home front. The war effort was total. It involved everyone.
I don't like it, Kathleen. It's no use pretending I do.
I know you don't, Mother. Nobody does. But there's no use in making a fuss, is there? Cheer up. There's a dear. Are you all right, Frida?
In a funny way, I always feel with war films that the boys run around firing guns and doing all sorts of things. It's women who are the kind of solid figures who see nations through wars. It's the commitment of women that see nations through wars.
In Which We Serve was perhaps Noel Coward's greatest wartime achievement, and amongst his many strokes of genius in the film, the most important was the casting of John Mills.
Hello, Blake. What are you doing here?
I'm on my honeymoon, sir.
Well, that's splendid. Congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Over the course of the war and well into the 1950s, Mills became the face of the war for millions of cinema goers.
Comfy?
What's your name?
Reed, sir.
Yes, Basil.
Grand job, Taylor. Thank you, sir. Captain Ansel, Sister Murdoch, Sister North.
I'm mad about the boy. And I know it's
in my memory, the war was black and white and it was fought by John Mills.
about the boy.
He becomes a sort of everyman. He is kind of guy next door material.
Must admit the sleepless nights I've
Colby?
ever
Yes.
On the silver screen, he melts my foolish heart in every single scene. Although I'm quite aware that
Hello, my
here
darling.
and
How
there
are you?
traces
Wonderful to hear from you again. Is it Freddie?
about the boy.
Well, I saw the way you looked at me when I got there.
I think if you put out a war movie with John Mills as a Nazi in the wartime, we'd be speaking German now.
A woman's work is never done here, mate. Come on, give us a kiss.
About the boy.
Despite the best efforts of John Mills and Noel Coward, the Battle of the Atlantic dragged on through 1942. And that year, a film was released that dramatised Britain's struggles at sea, but in a completely unique way. That Hamilton Woman told the story of Lord Nelson and his lover, Lady Hamilton, against the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars. The central characters were played by the most glamorous celebrity couple of the day, Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh.
They were the Becks and Posh of their day. They were the celebrity royalty.
My darling, come back. Come back.
The greatest expenditure went on the huge villa set of Sir William Hamilton in Naples, which allowed him to have these surging romantic tracking shots as Lady Hamilton ran through the villa into the arms of her lover Nelson.
But if cinemagoers thought they were watching a film only about the past, they were wrong. That Hamilton Woman may have been set in 1805, but it was about 1942, and its propaganda message was unmistakable to wartime audiences.
You are celebrating a peace with Napoleon Bonaparte. Peace is a very beautiful word, as long as the impulse of peace is behind it. But gentlemen, you will never make peace with Napoleon. He doesn't mean peace today. He just wants to gain a little time to rearm himself at sea and make new alliances with Italy and Spain, all to one purpose, to destroy our empire.
The great thing about the Napoleonic Wars is they lend themselves to the circumstances. Just as before Trafalgar, Britain is in danger of invasion. Menaced by a megalomaniac continental dictator, Napoleon then, Hitler now.
You cannot make peace with dictators. You have to destroy them, wipe them out. Gentlemen.
So the analogies are there. Britain at bay with the message, you mustn't worry, we've been here before and we will get out of it the way we got out of it before. I guess they've got to do it that way because, in fact, what we know is that behind the scenes, the British government had no idea how it was going to get out of this awful mess.
That Hamilton Woman was one of the hit films of 1942, a year that had begun with the hope of American assistance, but had become, instead, a year of disasters.
This morning's news of Japan's aggression is of successful countermeasures against the invasion of Malaya.
The war's going very, very badly. The Japanese had entered with terrifying effect in the Far East. You'd seen a succession of defeats.
Disasters like the loss of Singapore were accompanied by a new threat of invasion.
So suddenly you get this feeling of vulnerability. Are the Germans going to take advantage of this period of weakness to invade Britain?
Under an umbrella protecting fighter planes.
What the filmmakers are doing during this period is they are picking up on this vulnerability.
That silly pepper pot. I'll do it. I never had any children myself.
In the face of the new invasion fears, a war film was made that had one aim: to shock.
Have we never found out? Oh!
You see things in that film that actually you probably won't see very much today. There is, for instance, a shot of a young boy being shot in cold blood. I don't remember any modern Hollywood film that sees children being shot. it's taboo.
Went the Day Well is the story of an English village taken over by a group of German paratroopers in disguise.
Good day to you. Come to have a look at Bramley End, have you? Pretty little place. And a nice old church, too. 13th century, parts of it. Still, it won't be that that's brought you, I don't suppose. It'll be these names on this grave here, and the story that's buried along with them.
It is the greatest reassuring beginning. It tells you at the outset that it's okay. We are going to win. This is a film that has a good ending. This is a war that is going to have a good ending.
Look funny, don't they? German names in an English churchyard. They wanted England, these Jerrys did. And this is the only bit they got.
Went the Day Well was made at a time when a threat of invasion seemed to be very real. But the point was, it was very difficult actually to know what to tell people to do. There was a leaflet put out called In the Event of an Invasion, and everybody complained that it actually didn't tell them what to do. So in many ways, the simple message was to get out was this is a monstrous enemy, and he has to be resisted at all costs.
Before dealing with the Germans in their midst, the villagers of Bramley End have to follow a series of clues that slowly convince them that the company of Royal Engineers who have arrived in their village are not what they seem.
Why should they form their figures in the continental way?
The continental way?
Yes, the 7, for example. They've put a stroke across the middle of it. Look. There you are. And there's one of those elongated 5s.
You great bullying brute, you! Knocking a child about. You're a disgrace to your uniform. Why, you're no better than a German, that's what you are. Funny sort of way to spell chocolate. C-H-O-K-O-L-A-D-E. And what does Wien mean?
Chocolade is the German for chocolate. And Wien is the German for Vienna.
There's a very significant scene about halfway through the film where the troops reveal themselves in their true colours, if you like, as being Germans. And the officers, the character of the officers suddenly changes from being quite laid back and pleasant Englishmen, so it seems, to being these very brutal, autocratic, ruthless antagonists who herd all the villagers into the church.
Obey my orders, and you will not be harmed. Any person who attempts to escape or communicate with the outside world will be shot.
They shoot the vicar when he tries to ring the church bells in alarm.
But most of the violence in the film is not perpetrated by the Germans, but by the villagers, who escape and then fight back.
It's about how are you going to respond if we are invaded? Do you have the guts, really, is what it's saying. You know, are you astute enough? Are you gutsy enough to actually fight the enemy if it does happen?
May not fear the power of any adversaries.
In its efforts to shock, Went the Day Well used the most potent weapon in the armoury of any British war film, the humourless Nazi. A character that's become an established part of British movie culture.
Commandant Otter of the 5th Parachute Regiment.
Parachute?
We are Germans, my men and I.
Tonight we march against Poland, and tomorrow we'll see the dawn of a new order.
Don't let's be beastly to the Germans when our victory is ultimately won.
It was the way they moved, because they moved very clipped, like that. They were basically like Robocop.
And their Beethoven and Bach are really far worse than their bite. Let's be meek to them and turn the other cheek to them and try to bring out their latent sense of fun.
There's too much noise.
We were laughing.
Laughing. Oh, I see you have the British humour.
It's not just that the British are supposed to have a sense of humour, it's that the Germans are supposed not to have.
There will be no escape unless you wish to die. Now you can laugh if you wish.
The Germans could never debate.
Unless there is immediate silence, I will give the order to open fire!
You couldn't have a good-natured kind of thing. Well, actually, can I put my point across? No, because if somebody is trying to put a proper point in this accent, you will never take him seriously.
Let me emphasize it once more. The sole reward for trying to escape from Colditz will be death.
So, for you, the war is over.
Heil Hitler!
Der Führer!
Der Führer!
Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!
Are you loyal Germans, meine Herren? Or are you decadent democratic saboteurs?
The most innovative war film of the war years resisted the urge to turn the Germans into one-dimensional characters. The life and death of Colonel Blimp was about an unbreakable friendship between a German and an English officer, who meet in the Berlin of 1906.
Ready! Los!
It's very affecting to see the way Colonel Blimp shows the passage of two lives, the German and the Englishman, through the course of the first half of the 20th century.
The film asked a critical wartime question. Could Britain defeat the Nazis whilst following the traditional rules of war?
This is it.
There is a sequence right at the beginning of Colonel Blimp in which Blimp is in the Turkish bath and he's surprised in a war game by the arrival of his much younger rival who captures him because he started the war game early. It's not supposed to start till midnight, and he's outraged.
But war starts at midnight.
Oh yes, you say war starts at midnight. How do you know the enemy says so too?
But, my dear fellow, that was agreed, wasn't it?
Agreed, my foot. How many agreements have been kept by the enemy since this war started? We agreed to keep to the rules of the game and they go on kicking us in the pants. When I joined the army, the only agreement I entered into was to defend my country by every means at my disposal, not only by the National Sporting Club rules, but by every means that have existed since Cain slugged Abel.
Stop it.
Don't we know that they're counting on us to keep to the rules?
Stop
that
it.
They openly boast about it? That they laugh
Stop
at us?
it!
The story of Colonel Blimp encapsulates a recurring theme in British war movies, which is a dilemma that is clearly going on in the collective mind of Britain, which is how far should one stick to the rules? Because this is very much a strong English obsession. It's almost more important to stick to the rules than to win.
Put them up. Take that. I'll teach you. Think you can say what you like to an old un, do you? Do you know how many wars I've been in? I was fighting from the country when your father was still in Bumfleet.
Colonel Blimp was a technicolor fantasy, but the propaganda message was loud and clear. If Britain was going to win, the age of chivalry had to come to an end.
The key scene in Colonel Blimp is when Theo explains to his lifelong friend Win Candy that his ideas are out of date. In order to beat Nazi Germany, he cannot be the English gentleman of old. He cannot adopt those old-fashioned values. To beat Nazi Germany, who are thugs, they have to get down in the gutter and wrestle with them.
Dear old Clive, this is not a gentleman's war. This time you are fighting for your very existence against the most devilish idea ever created by a human brain. Nazism. And if you lose, there won't be a return match next year. Perhaps not even for 100 years.
Over the course of 1943, the British and their allies showed that they had learnt the same lessons as General Win Candy, as they began to turn the tide of the war against Germany.
In daylight, American pilots were over targets chosen for their importance to the German war effort.
Everybody is cheering, and what a wonderful sight this is.
By May 12th, it was all over. Bizerta and Tunis fell.
1959 Horse Marines! Truscott! Truscott, get that fat side over!
What had sowed the seeds for the successes of 1943 had been the rigorous training of the Allied armies. And in 1944, a film called The Way Ahead brought to the screen the ordeal of basic training that 2 million British men had gone through.
I think The Way Ahead is one of the best films ever made about war. It's brilliantly written and beautifully played and wonderfully well directed by Carol Reed. It's a classic. It should be seen over and over and over again.
And they wanted a film to show how a unit is forged from people of different backgrounds, classes and ages.
What do you think a barrack room inspection is, a joke? Laid out proper. You've got another 5 tons to shift yet?
The conscripts don't like being in the army. They don't like the conditions, they don't like the training, they're homesick.
You, and you.
Now, all this is taken in hand by 2 people. The tough professional sergeant, who's a regular army sergeant, William Hartnell, and the officer, and that's David Niven.
What's your name? Truscott, sir. Stand to attention when the officer addresses you. I take these names to the table.
David Niven was an officer in the army who had been to Sandhurst and been in the Highland Light Infantry. He could do the part.
When their training is complete, the unit are sent to North Africa to face the enemy, and everything they have learnt proves its worth.
Come on, lads. Once more for the day you missed on the exercise.
The very final scene of the film, they're marching into the Gunsmoke ahead against the enemy, and I think this indicates that they are marching into the future as a united, tested unit.
The implication of that is they've won the first battle, but there are many, many more battles still to go. We know, as an audience, that they will have battles across North Africa, they will have battles across Europe, and it's a long haul in front of us.
I think it's not a coincidence that The Way Ahead was made in 1944. After all, Eisenhower knew, the British Army knew, that 1944 was the year they were going to re-invade the continent of Europe. And I think The Way Ahead is a significant propaganda feature of the preparations for D-Day.
D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European forces.
With the war clearly entering its final stages, filmmakers in 1945 turned their attention to an issue that had been suppressed for 5 years. Waterloo Road lifted the lid on the greatest taboo of the war, sex and infidelity.
I don't love you, Ted. You know that, don't you?
No, never mind.
This doesn't mean anything, not really.
I know, it's just platonic.
It's the sort of thing that people didn't want to think about, which was the idea that women, the wives and sweethearts, fiancés of men away fighting might not actually be sitting at home keeping their home fires burning. They might actually be being unfaithful.
In the film, John Mills's character, Jim Coulter, goes AWOL to search the back streets around Waterloo Station for his wife, Tilly, who's been linked with that most hated of all wartime characters, the Spiv.
Hang on a minute, Tilly. I'll walk along with you.
Fred, I can't wait, Mr. Purvis. Do come on.
The Spiv is the great domestic villain of the war. I mean, almost as bad as a spy or a fifth columnist, because he's actually taking advantage of the absence of the fighting men.
I bet you $50 when she gets to the door, she'll look round and see if I'm coming.
We have an image of Britain as a nation pulling together heroically. There is a whole other side to the war that never gets discussed.
Oh, I don't know. I like 'em hard to get once in a while. Makes us change. Shirt.
Yes, Dad.
You've got lots of men being called up into the armed forces and they're away from home. You've got lots of women brought out for the first time from their homes into the factories and exposed quite literally to men in work situations that they'd never been in at all before. In those circumstances, inevitably, as we know from the census figures, the illegitimacy rate rises hugely.
In the end, Jim Coulter finally confronts his wife's seducer. And in one of the greatest fight sequences in British cinema, Stuart Granger's Spiv is trounced by John Mills's honest squad.
In the end, what we have is, of course, we have happy marriages, we have reconciliation between the wife and the husband.
Perhaps I'm beginning to understand you. More my fault than yours in the first place, and then...
What?
Well, I saw the way you looked at me when I got there.
How did I look, Jim?
I don't know. I just knew then and there it was all right, that's all.
Waterloo Road explored the real dilemmas of women during World War II, but war films have not always given women such a good deal.
Well, she's all you'd ever want. She's the kind I'd like to flaunt and take to dinner.
They think they're helping, I suppose, rushing about. What good can it do them? Or us? The weaker sex, the fair sex, the gentle sex.
Why, they're getting all sorts now.
Women form more than 50% of the population that actually went to the movies, and they want to see the image of themselves reflected through the cinema screen.
How I wish I was a man at this moment.
Some people have all the luck.
I'd awfully like to see you again sometime.
We might keep an eye on this one. She looks worth following.
One got a slightly odd view of women and girls sort of interrupting the action.
And you stop grinning about your love life and come and help.
But they didn't seem to understand. For me, these were boys' films, and we wanted to get on being boys, thank you very much.
You mean you'd rather be flying and making dull conversation with a strange girl?
You know, sometimes you can put a jinx on yourself getting mixed up with a girl. I'd like to have a nice long chat about you, and about me, and about you and me.
When you're in love with a beautiful woman, you know it's hard.
But the trouble was, see, in a lot of these films, you got to the stage where you wanted them to take their clothes off, and they didn't take their clothes off.
How about that?
That's fairly asking for trouble, that is.
Oh, knocking on the old Bristol City there. See, I love them.
In 1945, when the war in Europe was finally won, the attention of most people in Britain turned to the war in Burma, where thousands of British soldiers were still fighting, and this was also where Hollywood turned its attention and made one of the most controversial films of the war. Objective Burma told the story of a platoon of elite American paratroopers sent to destroy a Japanese radar base deep in the jungles of Burma.
Objective Burma is actually not at all a bad war movie in that sort of gung-ho America über alles way. And according to this film, the Burma campaign was won by Errol Flynn and a bunch of paratroops who'd come in to knock out a Japanese radio station. And the Burma campaign had been a very hard one, and had been fought by the British, the Chindits, by Indians, the Burmese, by the Chinese. There was hardly any, if at all, American presence there, and yet suddenly we've got this film in which there's very little recognition of the fact that the Brits happen to be doing a bit of fighting alongside them.
I saw history being made with every slash of the jungle knife as we battled our way through mud and mangrove, across danger-infested rivers and over treacherous mountain trails, smashing the enemy in his own strongholds, plunging ever onward to the deadliest enemy of all, the jungle itself.
When the film was premiered in London, there was a major outcry. The popular press demanded the film be withdrawn immediately.
What especially annoyed British audiences was the lead star.
Errol Flynn was Australian by birth and had been in England prior to going to Hollywood in the 30s, and he therefore, it was felt in this country, should have been part of the British Armed Forces. As it was, he spent the Second World War in the comfort of America, not hearing a shot fired in anger, and to see him portrayed as the heroic leader of a campaign really annoyed many people in Britain.
Looks like we're up a Burmese creek without any paddle.
Okay, Chuck, we'll have to swim out.
Can't do it. Wish we could. We'll have to walk.
And it was withdrawn immediately and was not shown in Britain until 1953, when they thought that things had died down a bit.
Objective Burma marked the start of Hollywood's habit of writing Britain out of the war. But in 1945, it was a small dispute between allies who were finally on the verge of complete victory.
In the small hours of this morning, May the 7th, 1945, I saw the formal acknowledgement by Germany's present leaders, military leaders, of their country's complete and utter defeat.
Scientists, British and American, have made the atomic bomb at last.
By the end of the war, it was clear that war films had contributed to victory. They'd made everyone feel part of the same struggle. They'd created new heroes and made ordinary sacrifice seem heroic. For a few years, cinema had even helped to convince the British that class differences could be overcome. In the post-war world, war films were to take on a new role to celebrate the victory. Forgotten stories of the POW camps emerged, as did those of secret missions kept hidden during the war. But in the films made after 1945, the unity of the war years was to disappear. In the post-war films that we're going to look at now, it was officers who were celebrated. The working class and women were, by the 1950s, to almost disappear. But in the immediate aftermath of final victory, one war film captured the mood of the whole country by confronting a subject that no one had wanted to discuss whilst the fighting continued: the pain of grief.
This was an airfield. Now not a soul is here. Empty. Empty hangars. The control tower. Once the very nerve center of the airfield. And now, derelict.
Way to the Stars was the poignant story of the men and women of an RAF base during the Battle of Britain.
A name, Johnny. A sign on the floor. All that is left of people who lived here.
Emotionally, it's a really interesting film because it's about a group of people who are incapable of expressing their emotions. They're so stiff upper lip.
The film explored the grief left in the wake of a series of RAF pilots who, one by one, are killed in action. But it does it, uniquely for a war film, through poetry.
Less said, the better. The bill unpaid, the dead letter. No roses at the end of Smith, my friend. Last words don't matter, for there are none to flatter. Words will not fill the post of Smith, the ghost.
I was a 16, 17-year-old lad from Yorkshire, not romantically inclined in that sense. I was from Yorkshire working class, more interested in football than poetry. But Michael Redgrave reading those John Putney poems was an immensely emotional experience. And I suspect there were most people in the theatre, most people in the cinema who watched it felt exactly the same.
The most powerful performance was delivered by Britain's greatest war film actor, John Mills.
I know what you've come to tell me, Peter.
You do?
Yes, you see, he didn't ring up this evening. And I counted one plane missing when you came back over the town. Tell me just one thing. How much hope is there?
It's partly about those very raw emotions and the inability of middle-class Englishmen to express them, and the inability of the women to confront them. And the whole film's about repression and the ways in which you can get round that through a piece of poetry.
It was a piece of paper with his writing on it, which I thought you might like.
I can't see without my glasses. What is it?
It's a bit of poetry, I think.
Will you read it for me?
Well,
Please.
One of the most memorable bits, for me at any rate, was when one of the pilots was killed, and he left behind a poem. Actually, it had been written by John Pudney, the words of it I recall: "Do not despair for Johnny head in air, he sleeps as sound as Johnny underground."
fetch out no shroud for Johnny in the cloud, and keep your tears for him in after years. Better by far for Johnny the bright star, to keep your head and see his children fed.
It's that moment where they're coming home, where we're about to build the post-war society. There's a lot of unfinished business, particularly of an interpersonal, familial type, and it's all very, very raw at the time that film comes out. And I can understand why it was such a huge success, because I doubt, as the cliché has it, there was a dry eye in the house, particularly when Mills does the poem.
Over 1/3 British men and women had been killed in the war, and for the families coming to terms with their grief, Way to the Stars hit a nerve. It was, perhaps unsurprisingly, voted the most popular film of 1945. But it was one of only a handful of films about the war made in the late 1940s. For almost a decade, the war film almost disappeared.
People were so fed up with the war. The one thing they did not want to do is hear about any more war. They had enough troubles of their own.
How I really knew that the war had ended, I went down to the canteen in Pinewood, and standing in front of me was a nun. And this nun was loading her tray with every form of food and drink. And she turned round to me and she said, "I think it's being a virgin that makes you so bloody hungry." And I was rather surprised that a nun would say that. And then suddenly I realised she wasn't a real nun. She was an extra in a film called Black Narcissus. And we were back to making fictional films.
Black Narcissus was just one of a series of romantic fantasies that entranced British cinema audiences in the years after 1945.
Where are you, Colin?
Britain was bankrupt and war-torn, and people were desperate for escapism. But there was one piece of unfinished business left over from the war: what to do about the Germans.
What's it like in Germany?
Must be terrible.
Well, they asked for it, they got it.
Yes, but you can't let them starve.
I don't know. I got a son out there. As far as I can see, it'd be a good thing if some of them did die.
Well, a lot of Germany is dead.
One of the major problems for the British in 1945 was what was going to happen to Germany. This was the second time, after all, that Germany had disturbed the peace of Europe. And yet at the same time, you were going to have to live with them.
The links between the people were smashed too. They were just left wandering, searching, looking for food, looking for their homes, looking for each other.
The German was really a very ambivalent figure. Did you really believe the German who said, "It wasn't me, I wasn't there, I was only obeying orders"? How many heroic German resistors were there? Actually, the British view was not very many of them.
One of the few war films made in the late 1940s got to the heart of the German question. Frida told the tale of a German nurse who rescues her lover, an RAF pilot, from a POW camp. Together they escape Germany to live with his family in the English village of Denfield.
But you've nothing to be frightened of. Nothing to worry about. They're just ordinary, everyday people. Most of the others in Denfield are much the same. You'll like them, all right.
But can they like me?
a German.
I have, obviously, a personal interest in Frida because my father, Leslie Norman, edited it. And it is a most unusual film because what the film reflects is the hostility shown towards this poor woman by the Brits in this little small town in England.
Is this the...
Yes.
Just a moment.
Because the very idea of, at that time, of anybody marrying a German woman, it's like collaboration with the enemy. Now, the film was made in 1947, and that feeling still persisted. And I remember my father telling me that, you know, there was a lot of hostility towards it when it first opened in Britain, because still people felt that, you know, a British officer should not marry, or a British soldier should not marry a German.
If I do right or wrong, if my heart is good or bad, I am a German. That is all that counts.
I'm sorry, Frida. You see, we're at war. When peace comes, public opinion will soften up. You'll see, Frida. You'll be the yardstick, the barometer. With every month that passes, things will become easier for you. 6 months from now, you'll be accepted here.
By you?
By 9 people out of 10.
By you?
I'm the 10th.
It's interesting because it was an issue. There's no question about this. I mean, I was in Germany after the war. I could speak German. I knew Germans. I had, if you like, German girlfriends. I don't think I would have brought a German girl back to England in those early years, the first 5-10 years after the war. I think I would have thought, God, you know, she's going to have a hell of a life, because there was a feeling of collective guilt.
Against the odds, Frida begins to settle into her new life until she and her now husband make a fateful trip to the cinema.
Horror in our time. Inside the gates of the Belsen concentration camp is a city of the living dead. Human beings reduced to worse degradation than the world has known, even in the darkest age.
Those shattering pieces of newsreel footage of the bulldozers coming in, and the bodies, and the lime pits, and the striped uniforms. And you can see the film image reflected in her face, and she's looking at it. This was done in our name.
The atrocious deeds committed in the name of Germany must never again desecrate the earth.
Yes, I mean, that's the question we all asked, wasn't it, you see? Even in Germany, we all said to Germans, but did you know about Belsen? Did you know about Auschwitz? Whatever we'd seen or saw photographs of. And, of course, most people said, no, we knew about concentration camps, but we didn't know they were gassing people in them. And, of course, they knew about concentration camps. Everybody knew about them from 1934 onwards.
My people did that.
No, Frida.
My people. Germans.
But did you know? Yes, you must have known.
I knew. I knew there were such places. We all knew.
Now, given that the Germans were in denial, the film doesn't let you forget. It actually focuses on something that remains, I think, central to the dilemma of German history since 1945. How do you live with a nation that has let the Holocaust happen on its soil?
This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life. The time comes quite soon as you leave Korea behind when you ask yourself just how ironic can things become.
The Queen is still sitting in King Edward's chair. The princes and princesses, the peers and peeresses, prepare to put on their coronets.
In the early 1950s, the austerity of the immediate post-war years began to ease. The shortages and hardships of the 1940s finally came to an end.
So by 1951, the government really is wanting to cheer people up. Things are starting to get better economically now. The post-war austerity is still there, but it's not as severe as it was.
In 1953, 12 years of paper rationing came to an end. What followed was a flood of new books, many of them war memoirs.
When I was being brought up, all the memoirs were coming out, and the war stories were coming out in paperbacks, cheaply, for the first time. So they were fresh off the presses, and people were getting real stories about SBOs, senior British officers.
The best were made into war films like The Cruel Sea.
This is a story of the Battle of the Atlantic. A story of an ocean, 2 ships, and a handful of men. The men are the heroes. The heroines are the ships. The only villain is the sea. The cruel sea. But man has made more cruel.
The Cruel Sea is legendary as a grimly tense and realistic film, made for an audience who are now ready to relive the war years in film.
Range 200. Range 100. Instant takeoff, sir. What's it look like now, number 1? It's the firmest contact we've ever had.
The Cruel Sea struck me as a far more gutty film than many conventional war films. That there was a hard edge to it.
Steer 220. Steer 220, sir.
The strongest scene, the most powerful scene in the film is where the Compass Rose is in pursuit of a U-boat, which has been doing an awful lot of damage, sunk a lot of ships.
Port 10. What's it look like, number 1?
Submarine, sir. Can't be anything else. Bearing 195, range...
And they come to a point where they are quite sure they are above this U-boat, and this is the time to drop the depth charges. Unfortunately, the sea around them is full of survivors from a ship.
Course 190, sir. What's it look like now, number 1?
Clear and solid, sir. Slight Doppler. Must be a U-boat.
So Jack Hawkins has to make the decision either to pick up the survivors or to drop the depth charges and destroy the U-boat.
There are some chaps in the water just there.
Well, there's a U-boat just underneath them. Bearing 191, range 300.
Attacking, stand by. Stand by.
In one hell of a decision to have to make. And of course he does what I suppose is the right decision, although it's the kind of decision that is clearly going to haunt him forever. He drops the depth charges and therefore destroys the submarine, but he also kills all the survivors who are swimming around in the water.
The Cruel Sea was the first in a series of classic war films that were to be made in the 1950s. Films that today still define our memory of the Second World War.
These were the movies we watched all through our childhood, and our respect, our admiration, almost our adulation for the people who'd done the things depicted in those movies was enormous. And there came a time for me in 1982 when I was with the British Task Force recapturing the Falklands. When you looked out and you saw all these grey warships heaving in these huge Atlantic swells, and I thought, my God, this is the Cruel Sea. I never thought I was going to see warships constantly searching for a submarine threat. When I had a frigate captain say as Argentine aircraft were coming in, remember chaps, when they come, give them hell. And I thought, they plucked all these lines out of all the things that Jack Hawkins and Richard Todd and John Mills used to say in the old movies.
The fighting talk of the heroes in the old war movies clearly lives on. But these films also celebrated one of the less well-known facts about military life, that the British forces drank their way through much of the war.
The First and Second World War could not have been fought
without a lot of booze and cigarettes.
Number one, the Admiral hasn't got a drink. Oh, right.
Rather looks as if you'll be seeing the Admiral home.
I abolished the rum ration in the Royal Navy in 1969. And I remember a diagram being shown, accidents at sea, which suddenly went up immediately after the rum had been issued.
Here you are, Count. The champagne will be along in a minute. That'll be hot, too.
I've ordered you a large pink gin. 4 ice-cold lager.
Mitchell, glass of port for the doctor. Bottles! I've got some brandy in my gears.
Oh, well, that'll do for a start.
Now, if we, as a generation, were facing death every day, we would be absolutely spanking it. If, you know, we get hammered, you know, just because the next day we can get a lie in.
Cigarette? No, thanks.
Why did we never think of this for 11s in the mess, Jasper? It's damn good.
Just ordinary bottle, rather heavily laced with sherry.
Port 20.
And don't drink it too quickly or you'll get hiccups.
Yes.
If you look at old films, people drink and smoke a lot more than they do in modern films. I'm sure that, yeah, quite a lot of our greatest heroes were sozzled throughout most of the war, because how could you not be?
You're gonna have quite a hangover when you wake up. Bless your heart.
Another part of the war that was defined by the films of the 1950s was the story of the POWs. During the conflict, people had known nothing of life in the camps, so the books and films about them that came out in the 1950s were enormously popular.
They offered a nice dramatic idea in that they brought the enemies together in a way that wouldn't require them to shoot each other, well, not immediately anyway. You could then discuss the war on a way without having to put it in a battlefield.
Beethoven. He is a good German.
Yeah, he's dead.
Attention!
But there is another reason why POW films became a popular genre amongst British filmmakers.
In one sense, from a filmmaker's point of view, they have a very obvious attraction. You're not dealing with a lot of scenery here, you're not dealing with aircraft, you're not dealing with moving people about. You can get all the heroism, if you like, of the British spirit, but you can get it filmically on the cheap.
The story of one POW camp became a legend and caught public imagination like no other.
I belong to Colditz, dear old Colditz Schloss. There's nothing the matter with Colditz if someone's discovered lost. It's only a dirty old prison camp, as the commandant knows quite well. If I get to a ghost, I will post you a letter, and Colditz can go to hell.
In 1945, few people had heard of Colditz Castle, but after a number of books, its fame began to grow, leading to the making of the classic film.
Colditz was the movie maker's dream because, first of all, it's set in the great East European castle. Second, the prisoners there are an international mix. And thirdly, the prisoners were, famously, the prisoners the Germans valued most. And so anybody who managed to escape from Colditz was doing fantastically well.
There's a wonderful scene in Colditz in which one of the prisoners leaps over the barbed wire, rather improbably, I think, and the cheering as the other prisoners watch him zigzagging across the open ground until he reaches cover. You know that the whole cinema was with him, because here he was, a plucky Brit in running shorts. It just summed up that one scene, our sense of ourselves as being the people who always had the guts, the energy, the cunning, if you like, in a good sense, to defeat the stony-hearted, cold, and yet blinkered Nazis.
it was quite clear to me at school that I was a prisoner of war. So that the films worked very well in that sense. I would have loved to have escaped from school. And as far as I could tell, we were there we hadn't done anything wrong, but we were clearly in some sort of prison. And we wanted to tunnel out of our school.
Special privileges will be granted to any prisoner volunteering to work for the internal economy of the German Reich.
And grown-ups larking about, for a child, it's like watching a good comedian. So those prisoner of war films were, for us, perfect. It wasn't escapism. We escaped into them, not out of them.
The Colditz story, like many other POW films, helped shape our view of what the prisoner of war experience in World War II was like. But how accurate were these films?
Most people made no attempt to escape. Only a relatively small number attempted to escape. For a start, your chances of getting away with it, unless you spoke German, were so slight. And an awful lot of those who tried to escape did so not because they really expected to succeed, but just as a means of relieving the ghastly monotony of the experience. So personally, I hate the prisoner of war movies because they seem to me almost an exception to romanticize to something that was a tragic human predicament.
Like almost all war films of the 1950s, the POW movies only told the stories of the officers as the old class divisions of the 1930s re-emerged.
The upper middle classes were trying to re-establish their place in society, at the top of society, by saying, look what we did during the war. We, the officer class, rescued Britain. It became much more class conscious. It was extraordinary.
The egalitarianism of the wartime films was long gone. In the 1950s, the heroes spoke the Queen's English and had all gone to the right schools.
Lovely spot, Richard, old boy. Reminds me of my early days at Caterham.
Most actors at the time were posh.
How do you do, my dear fella? How do you do?
Even the ones who had to play kind of lower class officers, a lot of the time were posh people put on kind of Cockney accents.
Oh, steady, you twerp. Oh, love a duck. No doubt you failed to notice.
When you look at them now, they do seem to be almost obsessively interested in class.
How do you mean?
Talking like with back teeth close together.
Very well, you go down there, take a second on the left, the first on the right, and you come to the ablutions.
The public school thing is replicated in the prisoner of war camp.
Jimmy Cooper! Hey! Jimmy! Welcome to Butlins!
I went to Butlins every single year as a child, and I think they look better than Butlins.
You shore up your side, and I'll shore up mine.
The officer class was obviously trustworthy, noble.
You don't say.
Having built into their DNA a sort of nobility and stiff upper lippery.
What makes you think that? I'm a medical student, sir.
Good Lord.
Where the hell are the real soldiers? Where the hell are the troops?
Well, cheerio, good luck.
Don't you ever think about anything but tunnels, Doc? Girls, for instance.
By the middle of the 1950s, the realities of life in post-war Britain seemed to many very distant from the antics of the POWs and officers in war films. The country's wealth had been spent and the empire had crumbled to nothing.
It took people a long time to realise that the victory was hollow, that the years of the British Empire were over, the Second World War had finished Britain as a world power. But the idea that we were a superpower has gone.
It's very hard for British people today to realise just how fixed that view was. We'd had the largest empire to become the largest Commonwealth. We had just beaten the greatest war machine the world had ever seen. We were top nation. I remember I even had a teacher in primary school who told us all very solemnly that Britain was the best country in the world in every respect, and that, she said, included the weather.
War films became part of a national nostalgia, a longing for a more exciting time when Britain had been a more powerful nation. And one film, made in the mid-50s, more than any other, captured the country's desire to relive the drama and dynamism of the war years.
It did have everything that a boy might want from a war film.
It was an extraordinary marriage of one man's genius, Barnes Wallis the scientist, and the courage of these young men who flew above a German dam in order to destroy it.
The attraction at the time was the success of the operation and the ingenuity of the operation. It wasn't just going out and shooting somebody. And that, together with the glamour of the RAF, made it especially attractive. Especially attractive to me because I live within 5 miles of the Ladybar, Derwent, Houghton reservoirs where the dam busters practice their dam busting. I actually saw those aeroplanes flying low over the Peak District of Derbyshire as they were practicing doing it.
The central character of the dam busters was the legendary Guy Gibson, played by Richard Todd.
Guy Gibson, of course, was true life heroes of the Second World War. And I thought it was a great honour to be chosen to play him and to depict him on the screen, and enjoyed making the film enormously. One of the reasons for that was because the whole thing was real.
Right, are you all ready? Once again.
The dam busters was so realistic that the bulk of the film was not about the raids on the dams, but the experiments behind the creation of the bouncing bomb.
Right. 3, 2, 1.
In peacetime, you have the luxury of making the first half of a movie about a scientist, a boffin, and his attempts to persuade people his idea is a good one. The second half, Guy Gibson takes over, and you actually get the raid on the dams trying to hit the water supply of the Ruhr. And he becomes the other character. Then in the final scene, they come together in this climactic moment where you get a big discussion about the moral responsibility of the two of them.
Is it true? All those fellows lost?
Only 2 aircraft went down in the attacks. That was Hopgood's over the Mer and Maudslay's over the Ada.
At the very end of the film, Barnes Wallis comes to me and says, "Is it true that 56 men died?" Yes, they did. But even if they'd known what was going to happen, they'd still have wanted to go.
You've had a worse night than any of us. Why don't you go and find the doctor and ask for one of his sleeping pills?
Aren't you going to turn in, Gibby?
No, I have to write some letters first.
That tells the story, doesn't it? 56 letters to parents or families. There we are.
These were the golden years of the British war film. Despite the huge changes the country was going through, epic tales from the war remained a firm favourite with the public. One of the most famous World War II films of the 1950s was also one of the most unusual.
For God's sake, sir, you break the string! Shut up!
Ice Cold and Alex is particularly interesting because it's a war film that isn't about combat. It's sort of sandwiched between moments of combat. It's basically a bunch of people thrown together in an ambulance in the desert who've got to get to Alexandria to save these 2 nurses.
Ice Cold and Alex also brought to the screen what most British war films had studiously avoided since 1945, women on active service.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning. We're a bit of a problem, aren't we?
Why?
I've never been in any real bombing before. I lost my nerve and ran away. Boat sailed without us. All our kit's on board.
That's the least of our worries.
And of course, Sylvia Sims looks simply wonderful, even in the middle of the desert, when in reality, all the skin would be peeling off her nose, but she still looked absolutely impeccable, even after however many weeks they're supposed to have been out there in this ambulance in the Western Desert. But it is a great movie.
Someone waiting for you?
Well, it's all rather complicated.
There was a famous scene where, on the sands, Sylvia Sims seduces the John Mills character.
You always know what you want.
Always.
The stills photographer unbuttoned her dress rather more than had actually happened during the film. And this was presented as the most steamy, erotic. This is, you know, the Second World War film grows up. You know, sexy Sylvia does it again, you know. Actually, it's got nothing to do with the film at all when you watch it. It's very, very tame and British mid-1950s.
You good old cow.
And then, of course, they arrive in Alexandria, and you get this, the second erotic scene in the film, which is where he drinks the lager. The lager becomes a kind of holy grail in the film, that no longer is the holy grail beating the Nazis, winning the war. The holy grail is just somehow getting through it, getting across the desert, so I can have a drink in the bar in a relatively normal way. So the holy grail just becomes a pint in the pub.
Worth waiting for.
J. Lee Thompson, the director, wanted John Mills to down this lager in one, as if he really hadn't had a drink for all that time he was in the ambulance in the red-hot sands of the desert. And apparently it was 6 takes, and each time John Mills downed his pint glass of lager, and he said not only was he completely pissed, but it was the most fun he'd ever had in a film studio. So,
good luck!
But the critical question left to the last scene is what to do with Anthony Quayle's character, who they have discovered is a German spy.
At the end of the film, what happens? The British ambulance crew decide to treat him as a prisoner of war because he's a decent chap. Take him off for a drink, to have the ice-cold in Alex, to have the ice-cold beer in the bar in Alexandria, rather than reveal him as the spy he is and have him put up against a wall and shot.
You haven't finished your beer.
An extraordinary example of how decency and fair play overcome the reality of this war.
The idealism has gone. This is all about human beings trying to survive and also trying to get a sense of self-belief back at a very, very disillusioned time. It's a very different kind of war film. It's about interpersonal relationships.
I've learned a lot about the English. So different from all I've been taught.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Ice Cold in Alex was amongst the last of the classic black and white British war films of the 1950s. Films that have become some of the nation's favourite movies. They glamorised the officer class, ignored working class characters, and women only got a look in right at the end. But they were also films that made great play of being historically accurate. Many were based on war memoirs or true stories, and they appealed to audiences who had strong memories of the war. But in the late 1950s and early 60s, a new audience emerged of younger people who had no personal memories of the war. They wanted excitement, not accuracy. For British war films to survive, they were going to have to change. And with Hollywood's money, its stars, and new adventure-based stories, they did. The Bridge on the River Kwai, released in 1957, was a psychological prisoner of war drama about a British commander who drives his men to build a bridge even though it assists the Japanese war effort.
I am the commanding officer of this camp. You British prisoners have been chosen to build a bridge across the River Kwai.
If one believes that there are two kinds of war movies fundamentally, there's reality movies which attempt to catch what it was really like, and there's fantasy movies which simply happen to use war as a setting for making a drama on film. Bridge on the River Kwai definitely comes in the second category. It's a great drama. It's going to be on anybody's list of the 100 best movies.
My name is Nicholson.
Give me the book.
Well, by all means. You read English, I take it.
Do you read Japanese?
I'm sorry, no. But if it's a matter of precise translation, I'm sure that can be arranged. You see, the code specifically states that the...
I think the importance of the film was that Alec Guinness really betrayed one of the central tenets of all these films, which is the Brits are individualistic, the Brits don't just take orders, and that they continue to believe in freedom. They're not like the Germans or the Japanese. And what Alec Guinness had done in the film, The Great Betrayal, was that he appeared to sign up to these values, the wrong values. He, in fact, was not behaving as an individual. He was not behaving as all the characters had in all the films we'd almost ever seen about the war.
The bridge on the River Kwai is...
Although Alec Guinness, David Lean the director, and most of the cast were British, much of the funding was American, and this had huge consequences.
In order to make Bridge of the River Kwai on the scale that it was made at, and with the ambition that it was made at, it was necessary to create a fictional character who was an American, who is a hero figure throughout the story.
You'll go on without me. That's an order. You make me sick with your heroics. There's a stench of death about you. You carry it in your pack like the plague. You and that Colonel Nicholson, you're two of a kind. Crazy with courage. For what? How to die like a gent. How to die by the rules. When the only important thing is how to live like a human being.
We were always annoyed when it gave the impression that the Americans had won the war or done anything like that. The fact they had won the war, we didn't want to be reminded of, thank you very much. And we certainly were not at all amused by the idea that you need American characters in so that the films could sell in America. Well, no, we could make our own films, couldn't we?
The bridge on the River Kwai, played against the naked canvas of war. Here is a vast panorama of human emotions, the courage and dignity of men who fight for their convictions, the humor of soldiers in the midst of tragedy.
I thought you were the enemy, sir. Well, I'm an American, if that's what you mean.
But how were they going to end it? They're going to blow up the bridge. Would Nicholson see the error of his ways and blow up the bridge himself? Would someone else blow up the bridge, one of the commandos under Jack Hawkins who'd come to blow it up? Or would it be an act of God with a piece of shrapnel landing on the detonator? They couldn't decide what was, from the point of view of the drama, the best way of doing it.
You.
What have I done?
And you're not quite sure. You just have that scintilla of doubt. Is he deliberately falling onto the detonator? I've seen the error of my ways, what have I done? Or does he fall, he's out of control of himself. But the brushing the dust off the hat, what have I done? And falling out, it's a wonderful, wonderful ending. And it leaves open the thought that maybe he was unrepentant even to the end. I think that's the greatest moment in Alec Guinness's film career. That moment where he says, "What have I done?" Very clever ending.
It's sensational. I don't know a film with a better last 10 minutes than Bridge Has a Require. I really don't. And, God, I'd give my eye teeth to produce anything as good.
Alec Guinness won an Oscar for his performance as Colonel Nicholson. And Bridge on the River Kwai became the great box office success of 1957. But it was now clear that war films were going to be dominated by Hollywood's money and Hollywood's tastes.
Only a hijacked prison train could blast them on their frenzied dash to freedom.
Much more sensationalism was required to get to an audience. You know, TV had happened, so movies had to compete with television. There was a shift away from, you know, the propaganda, obviously, away from the sturdy simplicity of a moral battle being fought, away from trying to be historically accurate, into a Alistair MacLean-style adventure films.
The Guns of Navarone, I promise you, is probably the most exciting film you will ever see.
The Guns of Navarone is on almost everybody's most favourite war movie list. I was lucky enough to go to the premiere when I was very young, and I must have seen it about 30 times and simply adored it each time. But it was really a sort of Second World War Western, in which Gregory Peck and his gang of cowboys managed to achieve these stupendous and almost literally impossible feats.
With a cast as exciting as the story it tells, Gregory Peck, David Niven. This is a story of unrivaled courage.
Guns of Navarone is about a specialist team having to climb up a cliff and plant some bombs to blow up two huge German guns. But, you know, in the context of a war movie, there's no battle being fought. There's no great sort of movement of troops. In fact, there aren't any troops in it, apart from sort of mindless Germans who are just there to be shot.
Alistair MacLean's best-selling novel, Live to the Hilt on the Islands of the Aegean Sea.
I remember even at the time, this was treated as a very mature adventure film. Churchill loved it. The greatest high adventure ever filmed, I remember, was the tagline. And they were trying to sort of take it away from ideological battle into the realm of adventure story.
This is Gregory Peck speaking, and I'd like to tell you something about the Guns of Navarone, because it's the most unusual film in which I've ever appeared. I play the role of Mallory, the man whose job it is to lead 6 expert cutthroats and saboteurs on a desperate and impossible mission. Watch out!
They were quite old. I mean, Niven is a veteran. He'd appeared in the 1930s and had also appeared in films in the Second World War. And so was Gregory Peck, had made his name in the late 40s. So these weren't youthful heroes. Despite that, they're not even out of puff when they go up a sheer cliff when they arrive in Greece. You know, they clamber up this sheer cliff, and only Niven has the courtesy to go at one point, as if he might be slightly out of breath.
You think that you've been getting away with it all this time, standing by. Well, son, your bystanding days are over. You're in it now, up to your neck. They told me that you're a genius with explosives. Start proving it!
It's been pointed out in the Guns of Navarone that you've got these big heroic figures. It's Gregory Peck, Anthony Quinn, and David Niven seems kind of feeble alongside that, but he's the one who was in the war. He's the one who had the medals.
The Guns of Navarone pioneered a new formula for the war film, one that would have been inconceivable in the 1950s.
Couldn't have been made 10 years earlier because people would have said, well, hold on a minute, what's the serious bit? Or why are these characters so disparate? Or, who's in charge? Or, and what are we trying to say about the Greeks? And what are we trying to say about the war in the Aegean? Or anything like that? No one's trying to say anything. People are just going to give us a terrific tale. And the setting of the Second World War from then on has always given that advantage. You want life and death? You want tension, the war can always give that.
What the Guns of Navarone also showed was that Hollywood's money allowed war films to finally afford convincing special effects. Decades of models and wobbly sets were over.
Special effects and pyrotechnics of some war films do seem a little crude.
Enemy aircraft are now bombing the aerodrome.
From the early 1960s, the budgets are bigger, that the American studios are making quite a lot of money in Europe, so they're using European actors, European locations, European studios, and you get big budget action spectaculars which seem to be set in the Second World War.
One of the most spectacular was The Great Escape, a film that found roles for some of Hollywood's biggest stars.
The Cooler King, who broke every rule as fast as the Germans made them.
It was like they said, right, okay, that film's done this, that film's done that, that film's done this, right, let's do the be-all and end-all. Let's do the daddy, let's not compromise at all. Let's get the best actors we can.
The great drama, the great entertainment, the great adventure begins with The Great Escape.
It almost becomes irrelevant, this issue of accuracy, so long as you can sort of vaguely suspend disbelief and imagine this might be in 1943. But it's a different thing. It's the war film mutating from something that's really connected to the Second World War into a repertoire of situations which enable an adventure narrative to happen.
Things got even more incredible a few years later in Where Eagles Dare, a film that made even The Great Escape seem gritty and realistic, but that audiences loved.
The best film ever made, according to most of the kids in my class in 1971, 1972, was Where Eagles Dare, where Clint Eastwood, Richard Burton, go up a mountain in Germany and apparently kill thousands of Nazis. Just two larger-than-life heroes seem to gun down most of the Third Reich.
Whereas in the Second World War, there's a lot of films about building things, engineering. In these adventure films, there's a lot of films about exploding them and destroying them. The number of bridges that went down in these films was quite extraordinary. And in The Guns of Navarone, the guns themselves get blown up. You have to finish with a conspicuous explosion that shows you spent a lot of money on this film.
The Heroes of Telemark. It is an adventure that takes a fantastic step of the most daring mass escape ever conceived in the mind of man. Exploits of World War II.
In the 1960s and into the early 70s, the march of Hollywood's wartime adventure romps seemed at times unstoppable.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the exciting news hour of Radio 1.
I heard the word shot and then Kennedy. This seemed too much, and so I staggered back into the press room.
But in the same years that saw World War II films abandon any pretense at realism, the terrible reality of a modern war began to undermine the whole genre.
The first television war, or at least the first war that television had access to, is taking place in Vietnam. It becomes very, very difficult to make films romanticizing war when you've got nightly on your screens the reality of napalm being dropped on people.
Come, you masters of war, you that build the big guns.
The clear moral values that had been celebrated through 2 generations of films about the Second World War clashed horribly with the chaos and moral uncertainty of Vietnam.
You that hide behind the wall.
The World War II film had also lost its appeal for another reason.
If the average age of cinema goers tends to be sort of 15 to 25, basically that's the bulk of the cinema going audience, who's interested? You know, they're all born after the second, in some cases 2 generations away from the Second World War by then. So who's interested?
By the mid-1970s, it was clear that audiences didn't want films about World War II anymore. So filmmakers applied the war film formula to fictional conflicts that they found in a galaxy far, far away.
What is Star Wars if it isn't a retelling of the Second World War for an American culture? The Second World War becomes the American Revolution. The Empire are the Europeans, they wear coal scuttle helmets, they behave like Nazis. The good guys are the Americans who liberate them. It's the Second World War refracted through the American Revolution.
But in the same decade that science fiction took over from the war film, in Britain something unexpected began to happen. Behind closed doors, the British war film was experiencing an unlikely revival.
Ironically, the war film gets a new lease of life in the 80s and 90s because it becomes shown again on television, and it's shown at key times where all the family is watching. So it becomes part of the routine of Easter, particularly part of the routine of Christmas, in which the family can unite behind these traditional films and watch them again and enjoy them together as a family. So they have a new lease of life.
It's the war. The whole bloody war.
I think you'll be surprised at how many you've seen without having intended to see. I mean, because they've been part of our TV schedules for so long, you could always guarantee that you'd turn on television and there was the end of Ice Cold in Alex. There was that postmistress killing the Nazi and went the day well. That's the way that this stuff has seeped into our collective consciousness.
But all this was part of a wider process in which the wartime generation itself was being rediscovered and reassessed.
After the end of the war in 1945, those people who had lived through the war wanted to put it behind them. It had gone on too long, it had been too painful an experience. By the 60s, they wanted to talk about it. They were ready to recount their wartime experiences. Nobody wanted to listen. Now I think that's changed. I think there are people now who want to talk about the war, and I think there's a younger generation who are in accord with them. They want to know, they want to question.
With each anniversary and commemoration of World War II, this renewed interest seemed to increase. For many veterans, this encouraged them to return to the battlefields and the cemeteries.
We were obviously approaching a time when men who had fought in the war were coming to the end of their lives and actually were in pretty considerable numbers and had been for some time going back to Europe, whether they were American or British, back to places where they had fought. There's a natural curiosity and interest amongst the children and also the grandchildren of veterans of the Second World War, begin to want to catch and grasp at something of what their fathers or grandfathers experienced.
Saving Private Ryan definitively brought the Second World War back to the cinema. It chimed completely with a new respect on both sides of the Atlantic for the wartime generation and a newfound desire to hear their war stories. The most famous sequence in this, or perhaps any war film, is the opening.
The first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan are the most extraordinary 20 minutes of film I've ever seen in my entire life. I mean, I remember watching it at the cinema, and I realised immediately we'd entered a new era of cinematography. It was unbelievable.
Saving Private Ryan was also the culmination of a process that had seen 2 generations of Hollywood producers chip away at the British role in the war. By the 1990s, the British had been almost completely expunged.
The only reference to the Brits in the entire film is someone says, Montgomery, he's always late. That's it. He's gone. The Brits have been written out of the story in Saving Private Ryan.
Steven Spielberg's epic did not inspire a large-scale revival of the war film in Britain or America, but its influence has been enormous in a completely new medium.
Lots of things happened when we landed.
If seeing it through the eyes of the soldiers in Saving Private Ryan took you this far, when you actually play the game, it just takes you so much further.
Video games like Call of Duty are now more accurate than any modern war film. They're based minutely upon the experiences of individual veterans.
I was the first man wounded in my company, shot through the right side in the flesh, which didn't keep me down, it knocked me down, and it burned like the dickens. But we had to put that.
Now, if that guy took a 15-year-old kid and sat him down in a living room and said, right, here's what happened. 5 minutes, the kid would be out the room, oh, this is boring. But through the medium of this game, that kid knows exactly what that guy went through.
We went on and we ran into the Germans. They bunched up and we had a firefight with them. And
that kid's not going to sit down and watch Dam Busters, really, realistically. That kid's not going to sit and watch The Cruel Sea. And it's quite astonishing the way that will just strip the years and this massive cultural divide that they've got between then and now. And it will just shrink them both together in a way that I cannot see how any other medium could do that, not even the war movie.
For many people in Britain, the most important stories from World War II will always be those told in the classic films of the 1950s. But the impact of these films is wider still. They have become, for most of us, our main window into this history.
War films keep the flame alive. They provide, for people who weren't there, an iconography, a set of stories, a set of characters, a set of social relations that remind you of what you think it must have been like. They are the trace in the culture. They're the things that keep the Second World War alive. They're our image of the Second World War now, and in many cases they've taken over from the reality. Someone who was born in the 1980s, their reality of the RAF is the Dam Busters.
You will be punished!
Their reality of the Burma Railway is the Bridge on the River Kwai. And that's film's incredible power to carry these visual cliches and create mental images.
Britain's great war films will outlast the veterans who fought the war. They will live on, long past those who starred in them. Like the memory of the war, they have taken on a new role in our culture and themselves become part of our national history.
My favourite film's got to be A Bridge Too Far.
I loved The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, In Which We Serve. My favourite film is The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp.
Mrs. Miniver.
The Bridge on the River Kwai.
The Way Ahead is, I think, a great film.
A Matter of Life and Death.
Millions Like Us.
Number two, because it's less hailed as a classic, is Went the Day Well.
Where do I begin about The Great Escape?
The Bridge on the River Kwai.
Or maybe A Matter of Life and Death as well.
there was a great deal of shock. People were sort of awestruck.
Those guys did more to change this country than I think we would ever realize. It was a cry for freedom.
We were electrified. None of us knew that was coming. And when it happened, it was so right.
The struggle in sports became the obligation of a generation.
Black Power Salute.